On 9/11, I was at the conference, not very different than this one. It was a conference related to aerospace and military devices. This was in Virginia, and at the Applied Physics Lab. And suddenly, the conference interrupted, and there was an announcement, and on the TVs, we're showing the tragic events that were happening. Little I knew that time that after a couple of years, I will have the honor to meet Colonel John Blitch, retired colonel, and doctor, who immediately after the event, ending his term at DARPA, went back to DARPA to lead, efforts related to robotics and rescue robotics and bringing the first robots to the Twin Towers there. And that triggered a relationship that I'm honored to call John a friend, and he's been very supportive to this efforts we had in the telepresence. And again, I'm pleased and happy to introduce John to be the next keynote speaker. Thank you, John.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it, Asia. Okay, so something a little bit different. Ethics, probably something that we don't talk about a lot in the laboratory where we're crunching code and so forth. So I have retired from the Air Force Academy and no longer teach there. So I no longer have to tell you this disclaimer. So now you can throw me in jail for anything I say. Hopefully that won't happen, but we'll see how things go. So about 6 or 7 months ago, I was approached by a DARPA colleague to propose an effort to the Estonian National Academy of Sciences to deal with first-person drones. And I don't know if anybody else has seen this video from about a year ago. And it was, if you look at it under YouTube, it's, Russian soldier surrenders to a drone. So this kicked off a lot of thoughts in my head. While I was at DARPA, there was this notion that teleoperation and telepresence is not DARPA hard. And here we are 25 years later, and we can all attest to the fact that it is quite hard, quite difficult. And so what you see here is a telepresence problem, because all you have is video, right? There's no acoustic feedback either way. There's no speaker on the drone. So they ended up having to drop a note to this guy to inspire him to put up with artillery fire, arguably from his own guys, who were trying to prevent him from surrendering. And then he finally makes it to the Ukrainian lines, et cetera, et cetera. So I ask you, did this soldier surrender to a robot? What do you think? I claim no. All that soldier did is surrender to other soldiers, other human beings. But this important part is it was without GPS in a GPS denied area and no internet connection. And so this is combat. This is the reality of disasters. World Trade Center, very similar. Cell phones not working. We weren't as dependent upon our cell phones at that time and the internet as we have been before, or as we are now. But that's the area that I want to get into with this notion of decision density, heavy decisions. So you heard me rant last year in Hawaii about aggregate teaming, the sum of the parts sort of approach. I claim that the Air Force is more like that than the Army and the Navy, versus collaborative teaming. So when we're picking robot versus human, we're in an aggregate situation. When we're trying to integrate robots with humans, we're in more of a collaborative situation. And so I was just down in Brazil, giving a talk at the Horasis meeting on meeting our AI overlords and how we're going to avoid Skynet and the Cylon War. And I want to cite David Brummer for this notion of equestrianship as a relationship between a human and a horse is a similar manner to a human and a robot. However, his view was more towards we want to get to a centaur situation. And I immediately, being a military guy, went straight to Jean-Luc Picard being a Borg, right? And so my background in rescue robotics after the World Trade Center, et cetera, leads me to more of a friendly notion of the centaur firefighter or multiple centaur firefighters coming to rescue you. So this is the yin yang of the difficult decisions when it comes to either risking lives or taking lives. Now, back to the tactical scenario, we have this equestrian relationship in a tactical realm where teleoperation or RC control reigns supreme because there's low automation. There's not no automation. Just because you're teleoperating doesn't mean it's stupid. And it's there can be a brilliant module on both sides of that, as we heard from the last speaker. And that really bothers me when I hear people at DARPA talk about this. That's not DARPA hard. However, when we're talking about ethics, as we migrate towards multiple horses under control of a single human being, and maybe letting go of the reins altogether. I'm not sure I would have done this with my troops and just, stand up and expose yourself to the enemy. But the point is that as we get into a high autonomy or full autonomy situation, this control loosens up quite a bit, right? To the point that you may not even have any reins at all. And that leads to some challenges when we're talking about accountability. Now, I know it's difficult to talk about accountability in a country that just elected a convicted felon as its president, okay? That's just a fact. If any of my Republican friends don't try to stab my tires in the parking lot, it's just a fact. But if we look at the killing aspect of this, at the advent of human evolution, cave people knew everything about their victim. You could touch them, you could feel them, you would taste their blood in your mouth. But then as we progress technologically, we start to lose connectivity with our victims. I go to a knife. I no longer have my hands on their skin. I don't feel the temperature, the texture. We put the knife on the end of a spear. We get a little bit further distant. And then when it comes to artillery, you don't even see your victim. But this is what sent me into special forces and robotics, because I could not deal with the temporal separation from my victims. Because arguably, when I was in East Germany training to launch nuclear weapons, or I was in Western Germany training to launch nuclear weapons into East Germany, how do I know I'm not killing my own grandkids? So I am separating myself not only from my victims in current time, but far into the future. And I couldn't deal with that anymore. Went into special forces and screwed up a lot of stuff there. But my point is that this temporal separation brings us into a problem in terms of accountability. Now, backing it off a little bit, this is current day with what a Predator drone operator is doing. And you have this lieutenant colonel in the Air Force who is thousands of miles away, and she has to make the decision whether or not to use deadly force based on that. A black and white screen, no acoustic, no vibral tactile, no olfaction. So is she really telepresent? And are we, as a telepresence community, totally reliant on visual mechanisms, visual modalities? Are we leading ourselves towards the next Cylon War? So when we talk about accountability, again, we have a single operator on the horse, single robot. Direct accountability is feasible. That was your robot. you're teleoperating him, you're going to jail, or at least you're going to go face number. But as we add more and more robots, robot swarms, how do we pin that tail on the donkey? How do we know? It's a herd of wild horses. It's herding cats. How do we come to grips with this? And why should we? Well, first of all, it's preventing negative influence on society, right? We separate the criminals, put them in jail, at least for a little while. And then there's a punishment for deterrence, of course, as you're looking into others. But then there's this notion of if we force accountability, maybe we can catch the bigger fish when we're talking about law enforcement. So before anybody just gives up on the United States of America, because we have this criminal running our country now, think the long term, right? Don't take it from him. Don't take it from me. Take it from Lance, because he went from top of the heap after his confection. Now his legacy is as a criminal. So keep the faith. Accountability comes around at some point or another. And if nothing else, force the accountability in yourself, because we learn from our mistakes, right? Mistakes are growth. And here's the thing. What I used to do at the Air Force Academy is I would do all of my tests in the open, in public, on whiteboards all around the classroom. Because the idea was that if you did well, that emotional uptake in your neurotransmitters, that made that memory of getting those answers correct very positive, and that makes it more durable. It lasts longer in your brain. And if you didn't do so well, which was me, 2.41 GPA, I still remember those answers, the correct answers, because I had a deep emotional content with it. And then, of course, fear and negative emotions that you can't forget, even though you try to, that gives way to spiritual, or PTSD. Now, when we're talking about spiritual progression, there's this post-confessional high, and I would love to have Lance Armstrong in the room right now and ask him how he felt after he came out to Oprah. And then there's plenty of scientific literature support for this in the neuroscience world. But that's not my focus. I want to focus on this notion of second responders. First responders are you. When you get in a car accident, you are the first responder because you're trying to get the hell out of that thing. The second responders are my friends and family and folks that have dealt with my problems. But here's the thing in accountability. It's an opportunity for growth, right? So all of these things, I set a record number of demerits at the academy. I was at the bottom of my class, and then they put me in charge of nuclear weapons, right? But that memory, all of those components leads to opportunities. This is my standard quote. You guys saw this last year about, the only reason anybody's going to follow this guy into combat is out of curiosity that he's going to screw up. But I was lost so much, I ended up testing GPSs. And so that sent me back to graduate school, Colorado School of Mines, computer science, and robotics. So there are these aspects of accountability that can be very positive. Now, on this positivity aspect of things, getting credit for something that you never talked about. What is better? To hear about somebody talking about themselves and the great things that they did, or to hear it secondhand from somebody else? And so forcing accountability of what really happened, then you find out that this is the guy that deserves the Medal of Honor, not this guy. And that just happened 17 years after the Battle of Roberts Ridge. And you can look it up for Sergeant or Chappie, John Chapman. Okay, anyway, and then there's this notion of accepting risk by not just risking STDs, but risking your body, destroying your body if you're going to bring a child into this world, paternal, fraternal. So we all accept risk on behalf of each other, and I consider that to be a form of love. Now, professionals get paid to accept risk. But what about volunteers, the engineers, the folks that came with me to the World Trade Center? Now look at this picture. I showed this last year. Here you have a blue law enforcement officer handing over the baby to a red firefighter. That symbology is intended, obviously. But these are the guys that I talked about last year after the Maui fires. And what you got to understand is many of these folks in this profession are putting out your house fire while their house is burning in the background. So talk about a form of love, right? And so I want to draw Robin Murphy, Tom Frost, and Arnie Mangolds, as well as Chief Ray Downey up in the upper right-hand corner as the world's greatest lovers, right? These folks volunteer to rush in when everybody else is rushing out. And this is one of my favorite folks on the planet, Mark Masseri and Jen Casper. Mark, one of Holly Yanko's students, probably your secondary son or tertiary, I don't know. He went on to work at NASA and took over the Intelligent Robotics Group. But what he did when he came back from the World Trade Center is he went through firefighter training because he knew you have to walk the walk before talking the talk. And so the nature of this is that these are the folks that don't get credit right away. The accountability that is forced upon the situation gives them credit. And to quote Chief Harold Chapel-Holman, resilience starts with accountability. So you have to accept your mistakes and you have to accept your rewards as part of that development of resilience. Now, here's my claim. You know, as a cognitive neuroscientist, a rebranded roboticist, if you will, I've got very deep into the neuroscience of human-robot interaction, but I always bumped up against my colleagues who were very pessimistic with regards to human beings. And it stunned me. So what do you guys think? Are we Sith Lords like Kylo Ren, or are we Jedi, right? Where are we going to go with this? If you look at the internet, if you turn any machine learning algorithm loose and use the internet unfiltered, we're all dead. You know, Skynet is coming because we look like idiots, right? But it's not just the internet. Look at the media. Why does the media push fear? Because from a neuroscience basis, that's the most durable memory. That's how to sell you. And that's another reason why horror movies still make a ton of money over romantic comedies. And it makes sense evolutionarily, right? We need to remember what a saber-toothed tiger looked like, acted like, smelled like. Otherwise, we'd never leave the cave. So it makes sense to do that. Now, what about us? What about academia? Are we screwing humanity? I claim yes. And why? Because nobody gets published talking about how good humans are. We all got published by exposing a problem in human reasoning and coming up with a computer solution to solve that. And again, this is a problem in bias across the board. So in terms of what I claim here is that we focus too much on low density decision making. You know, well, in our lab back at Colorado State, we'd give kids $20, right? And then we tease them and manipulate them to invest that $20 or whatever, and then make these grandiose claims that, you know, all humans are stupid probabilistically, right? So what's the consequence of that? You lose $20, but you didn't have the $20 when you came in the classroom in the first place. So what's the weight? What's the impact of that decision? Not a high density situation. So let me skip through these. Well, you know, navigation. What are the consequences of you getting lost? You're 5 minutes late. What's the big deal? Unless you're coming to a conference and you're up first, well, maybe that might ramp it up a little bit, right? Or if you're in combat and somebody's dependent on you getting there, or if you're in an ambulance, right? So there are consequences. So you go from light decisions to heavy decisions very quickly. So these heavy decisions, everybody recognize John Dunbar from Dances with Wolves, right? So He's sitting there in the middle of this battle, it's stalemate, and he decides to commit suicide. He just gets up, jumps on his horse, and he, in a momentary insanity point, he inspires his side, the Union, to overrun the Confederate lines. And as a result, the general comes over and he begs him not to amputate his leg, because pretty much anybody that got wounded below the hips, that leg was coming off. And he begged the general to save his foot. And the general did. But that's an example of a heavy decision, right? Lives are on your own life. Whoop. How did that happen? All right. Oklahoma City. David Tuggle and Andy Sullivan are a few blocks away in a hospital when Timothy McVeigh blows up the Murrah building. Building collapses. Dana Bradley is caught under the rubble. They are called to the situation, and they are trying to figure out if there's any way to extract her from the rubble without amputating her leg. In the middle of this, somebody from the FBI discovers a secondary device, and everybody is pulled off the pile. They have to leave her there. The firefighters had to drag these two surgeons out of that rubble for an hour. Now, that motivated me to develop little robots to keep people company on a collapsed structure for search and rescue and find all other sorts. But can you imagine what was going through their heads for an hour? Do you leave that patient behind? That's a heavy decision, right? Not to mention, what's the structural stability? Am I going to lose my life while I'm in there? And what's the disposition of the other victims? If you're the incident commander, when do you decide to transition from rescue to recovery? Whenever you hear that, you need to recognize what's going on. That means they will bring a bulldozer in or a crane in and start lifting rubble. What that means is that there's anybody still underneath that pixie sticks chaotic distribution of debris, they're dead. So you are now, as the incident commander, potentially killing more people than you're going to rescue. A gut-wrenching decision. So I've been struggling with how to inject this notion of these heavy decisions into both computer science and cognitive neuroscience. And I've been trying to play with this notion of density. So it's not just the weight of the decision. That's one thing. But then you have this issue of information. How much information? And when you're in a disaster, that is fleeting. You never have enough information. It's just like combat. The intelligence guys tell you this, that, and the other thing. Bill McBride, one of my best friends from DARPA days, used to tell me about this story in Vietnam where he was in a firefight. Bullets are going every which way but loose. And he calls back to his battalion headquarters and they say, well, it's all green on my map. And he's like, wait, I'm in the middle of a firefight. How can you be telling me that? And then there's the notion of the reliability of the information. Somebody comes up to you and says, hey, I heard a little kid screaming. When we were at the World Trade Center, somebody told Arnie Mangolds that somebody had gotten a hit on a cell phone in a boiler room. Well, that was about 10 hours old, and we spent a lot of time looking in that area. So, I went from Venn diagram to this notion of volume, right? It looks a little bit like Mickey Mouse, and then I decided maybe a carbon molecule ought to be a little bit closer. But the bottom line is there's a lot to consider in this. And I want to launch into this and sort of inspire some of you folks getting into these heavy decisions down the line. Now, the question is, how do we measure it? My claim is you got to go EEG. You got to go brainwaves. And my rationale is that a lot of times asking somebody, hey, are you feeling uncomfortable while you're operating this robot? Well, you got to stop operating the robot to answer the question. But even if you wait until after the task, You can't not think about it. It's kind of like the old psychology experiment of, hey, don't think about a white rabbit for the next 45 minutes of class, right? And then all you can think about is a white rabbit. So what I showed for my dissertation was that, you know, we can detect neurophysiologically when you're going to disengage with that drone or that robot way in advance of when you actually show it in performance. We get upstream of it, and that allows us to intervene before you start driving off the road. But more importantly, what I showed was that subjective self-report mechanisms like the NASA TLX can actually drain your cognitive resources while you're trying to operate that robot. So using EEG gets away from all that. But as we heard earlier, my claim is that if we're going to team up with this robot, if you're going to have a centaur, if we're going to migrate towards a centaur, and the machine is operating at the millisecond level, much faster than that, we got to get to at least millisecond level of communication from the human. Otherwise, we're slowing the whole team down. So that's why brain control is the future that we need to get to, especially in high dynamic situations like combat, when seconds means lives, right? Okay, so and naturalistically, how do we get to these high density situations? You got to get out of the laboratory. So this is me and some of my guys in the pool at Wright State University, then up in Pavilion Lake with Darlene Lim on the NASA Pavilion Lake project. And they're all wearing these portable EEG systems that I have. This was climbing Mount Everest. This guy, Swedish guy, almost killed me because I had to stay within 30 meters of him, you know, with Bluetooth range, and I was dying. He was running up that doggone mountain. But what came out of that was an appreciation for the downside of the human portion of the human robot team, altitude sickness. And this, they did not want to admit that. This is the other problem, right? The ego doesn't want to admit that. So this is polluting my data, dagnabbit. And then same thing with these guys. So this is during Nemo in 2016, 2015, I think. These guys were doing a robot rescue mission on Mars. Mars was underwater. We were in orbit aboard this boat. These guys are wearing my EG stuff here. And then you get all this chaotic, you know, distribution of tethers and so forth that we just heard earlier, makes things unpredictable, unstructured. But here's the thing, the secrets that people tell you outside the laboratory are gold because it can explain the anomalies in your data. And so I found out after the fact that these guys were horrifically seasick. But it was important, right? Because we need that aspect of the human side to understand it. So while we're talking about secrets, anybody recognize any of these guys? Dave Grush, Dave Fravor, Top Gun, Ryan Graves. They testified a year ago that UFOs are real in front of Congress. 2 days ago, these guys testified not only that they're real, not only have we recovered crashed UFOs, but there are non-human biologics on it. And we have been lying to, these are all government officials. Admiral Tim Gallaudet, Dr. Gallaudet, director of NOAA. Lou Elizondo, Michael Shermer, and Mike Gold, all friends of mine. Mike Gold, it's interesting. If you look at his hand, what he's holding up, you see the Vulcan, live long and prosper. He's the only guy with a sense of humor in there. He was the senior attorney for NASA. So I'm not telling you this. Your government is telling you that aliens are real. And so those secrets make me question if there is anything that I have done that's worth a damn. Because how do I know? When you propose your dissertation, you got to do this literature review and claim that nobody's ever done it before, right? How do you know that in some laboratory halfway around the world, somebody else hasn't done exactly what you proposed? But against that, happy horse pucky, I want to get back into the motivation part of this. Don't hit the easy button. Get out of the lab. I know you got to do the laboratory, you got to do simulations and so forth, but get out of the lab. Go into the uncomfortable areas where the high density decisions are being made. Make sure you push across all sensing modalities, because you don't know whether or not that temperature variation that you can feel on your skin and the robot can't, that could be the key to finding the anomaly in that data. And don't, whatever you do, for the sake of God, don't inspire the silence. No matter how attractive they get, be good to your fellow humans. Whether or not you disagree with them or not, whatever they published in that article, do it with respect and dignity. And by all means, bleed purple. All right, well, that's it. I've got, for Q&A, I've got a couple of books coming out. I know I promised you this last year. The mighty United States Department of Defense has been screening it for the secrets that I've divulged. So it has been under DOPSA review for a freaking year, but it's coming out, I promise. And then I've got another one on the UFO thing coming out as well. So questions?